In this part of the country, our urban public transit networks are embarrassing. Buses come every hour, or half hour if you're lucky, and trains, they're not even an option, as I declared in a recent video.
In the next decade, trains are going to make a big comeback in the United States.
In that video, we talked mostly about regional trains, highlighting the upcoming Amtrak connection between Oklahoma City and Wichita. But today, I want to talk about the role of rail in a local transportation network within a city. We'll be discussing different categories of urban rail transportation, their global and historical applications, and some potential paths forward for implementation in small to mid-sized cities around the US. Now, you might think that local trains are a somewhat far-fetched idea for a mid-sized city like Tulsa or Oklahoma City, but in Europe, several cities around the same population, such as Bilbao, Oslo, and Nuremberg, all have full-fledged metro rail systems. Even here in the US, a few mid-sized cities like Cleveland, Ohio, and Honolulu, Hawaii, have individual metro lines. And wait, maybe Oklahoma City does too? Welcome to eryngo.urbanism. Okay, so you probably already called my bluff. OKC most certainly does not have a metro line. What it does have is a streetcar, and this is a great example of why it's important to be very clear about classifying different types of rail systems. So before we start diving into streetcars, we're going to take a moment to go over how I understand the different types of passenger rail systems to be classified. At the broadest level, planners in the US talk about two types of passenger rail: heavy rail and light rail. These categories are nearly meaningless, but I imagine this dichotomy to be more of a spectrum on which more useful categories can be placed. In theory, further left on the spectrum means smaller vehicles, smaller stops, and shared rights-of-way. Essentially, you build less infrastructure for less overall cost. Naturally, the other end of the spectrum is pretty much the reverse. More infrastructure, higher capacity, and more expensive to build. If we get a bit more specific, we can begin to create some discrete categories. On the light end, we have trams. In the middle somewhere, we have metros, and on the heavy end, there's regional rail. I'd argue that these are actually the three most important categories to think about, and that a great transportation network really should take advantage of the strengths of all three of these typologies. But what do these categories even look like? Let's start by looking at streetcars, which is the only category I can currently show you here in Oklahoma. Streetcars fall on the lightest end of the tram category. You can essentially think of them as like a bus on rails. And actually, this comparison directly points to their historical significance and development. According to Roxanne Warren in her book Rail in the City, when railways were first introduced in the streets of New York in 1832, it very quickly became obvious to the operators of horse-drawn omnibuses that with the extremely low rolling resistance of steel-on-steel contact, their horses could pull heavy loads of passengers much more easily over rails than over rough pavement. Yes, the first urban streetcar network began nearly 200 years ago and was quite literally horse-powered. Over the century that followed, electric motors were introduced, and developers realized that they could drastically increase the value of land on the outskirts of a city simply by constructing an electric streetcar line that connected the land to the city's core. And as a result, every growing city and town at the time had a thriving network of streetcars serving what were known as streetcar suburbs. For example, in Tulsa, the streetcars ran as far out as the fairgrounds, while in Oklahoma City, streetcars connected from Capitol Hill to Nichols Hills. The second innovation in U.S. electric passenger rail was the interurban. These were essentially long-distance streetcars designed to connect a core city to its surrounding towns. Tulsa was connected via electric interurban to Sand Springs and Sapulpa, while Oklahoma City was connected to Guthrie, Norman, and El Reno. But what happened to all of these streetcars and interurbans of old? After World War II, car companies began producing on a mass scale. This provided people with alternate means to get around, and it provided developers with a chance to continue developing cheap land on the outskirts, now with a reduced overhead cost. Auto companies began lobbying against any government assistance to continue providing streetcar service, so the profit incentives for the streetcar companies dried up, and they quickly began disappearing. Here in the state of Oklahoma, every single one of them was eventually removed. But now, streetcars are making a surprising comeback. Cities like Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Oklahoma City have all recently installed modern streetcars, so let's go check one out. I've actually now taken the Oklahoma City streetcar several times, and the experience is generally pretty good. Here's what I like. It's clean, user-friendly, bike-friendly, and it does serve its intended purpose as a downtown circulator. I've occasionally worked a streetcar into a portion of my cycling commute home from work, especially if my legs are particularly tired or if the weather is somewhat questionable. Interestingly, my complaints about the design of the system have changed slowly with time. Initially, I thought that the design of a one-way loop was a poor design choice. I mean, if you think about a perfectly circular loop, going from A to B might be fine, but getting back to point A involves riding all the way around the rest of the loop. But after actually riding, I realized that this particular critique is not all that relevant to the OKC streetcar. While sure it is in fact functionally a one-way loop, it's not shaped like a perfect circle. If you're willing to walk up to 1 or 2 blocks, you can actually use it to get both to your destination and back to your point of origin, as long as you're traveling at least a couple of stops and you're willing to get a little bit creative. For shorter trips from, say, one stop to the next, you're probably just better off making the return trip on foot. Now that I've actually ridden the streetcar, I have less complaints about the design of the line. My complaints are now based on a better understanding of the role of streetcars and more generally trams in a comprehensive transportation network. It's really helpful to think about a tram as a way to extend the distance you can travel on foot. In this way, a streetcar is great for trips of around a mile or 2. The OKC streetcar connects Bricktown, Midtown, Automobile Alley, and the Central Business District, making a large part of OKC much more walkable than it otherwise would be. But it really is only a last mile mode of transportation. At the moment, it really functions best if you somehow find yourself needing to get from one point of downtown to another. This can be useful if you work downtown and want to grab lunch, or if you live downtown and want to go to a bar. But this very small line leaves much of the city disconnected. Additionally, the streetcar is quite slow. Not only does it have to wait at stop signs, stop lights, and roundabouts, but I've also experienced on a couple of occasions stops of several minutes just to swap out drivers. It even pauses part of the way through the route to switch between catenary cables and battery power for reasons I really don't fully understand. If you're only traveling between Midtown and Bricktown, it might not be that big of a deal that the trip takes about 20 minutes, but if a similar system were extended all the way across the city, travel across the network could take hours. And this brings me back to our 3 different classifications of rail we talked about earlier. You see, I'm now convinced that the streetcar is actually pretty great, but it would be even better as a small part of a larger network. There have been a couple of proposed extensions in OKC, but I don't think simply extending the existing streetcar would be the best approach. Over a longer distance, there are some significant advantages to creating a full-fledged metro-style service. While a fully grade-separated, full-fledged heavy rail system, more commonly known in the US as a subway, might be a bit excessive for a place like Oklahoma, I do think that there is a good argument to be made for a light metro. Essentially, the goal would be to create a light rail network that is fully separated from the streets. This would give trains a significant advantage over buses and even over cars by eliminating the need to stop at stoplights. These stops could be placed fairly far apart, up to maybe a mile or 2, which would allow for very fast point-to-point connections across large distances within the city. And from these metro stations, streetcars can be used as a last-mile extension to bring more people to these services. Passenger rail works best when it's implemented at multiple scales. A tram might let you get to a metro station, which might take you to a regional train station or an airport that can take you to a different city, where from there you can repeat the process in reverse to get to your final destination. At no point along this journey do you need to worry about parking, gas, or a semi-truck smashing into you. In Oklahoma City, the streetcar has already been catalyzing more density and development along its route, even though it might still be missing some of these longer distance urban and regional connections. If we keep building dense, walkable neighborhoods of transit-oriented development surrounding these rail networks, we would be building cities that are much more enjoyable to inhabit and to visit. And to learn about how these walkable neighborhoods can start to take shape, you need to check out this video. We've recently reached 5,000 subscribers, and I just want to give a big thank you to all of you who are subscribed, as well as all of you who are supporting me on Patreon. It means a lot to me.